Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 359. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing? Doing very well. And Connor, along with, myself, Scott Horton, James Bovard, Lori Calhoun, Sheldon Richmond, and a lot of others, make up the Libertarian Institute, one of the, best organizations putting out content right now in the liberty movement. And we're holding a fundraiser right now. So if you'd like to help us out, go on over to the Libertarian Institute and make sure, me and Connor can keep putting out this show, but also, writing articles every day. Scott Horton's writing another book for the Institute. So we're putting out a lot of great content. Head on over to the Libertarian Institute and check that out. Now everybody can make a donation. That's okay. If you want to help out the show in another way, just share it somewhere. Twitter, Facebook, whatever, you got to put it out there. The show's on Twitter at con_interest. You can find it at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, and you can subscribe anywhere you listen to audio podcasts. You can also support the show by doing your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE, and that's going to save you 20% when you spend $75 or more, and it's going to get the show kickback. So it's a great way to help out yourself and to help out your favorite podcast. And with that, Connor, let's get into today's news. I got a few kind of different collection of stories to cover on today's show. The first is Congress unveils the $858 billion National Defense Authorization Act. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Congress on Tuesday night unveiled the 2023 NDAA, worth $858 billion, $45 billion more than what President Biden requested for the military spending bill. The House is expected to vote on the legislation this week, and it could be brought to the floor as soon as Thursday. Once the House approves the bill, it will be sent to the Senate, then to President Biden's desk for his signature. The massive $858 billion bill represents an 8% increase from the 2022 NDAA, which was larger than what Biden requested. That $858 billion includes $817 billion for the Pentagon, and the remaining funding goes towards the military and other departments. Notable amendments packed into the NDAA include $10 billion in military aid for Taiwan that will be dispersed over 5 years. The aid is from the Foreign Military Financing, a State Department program that gives governments funding to purchase U.S.-made military equipment. Then the NDAA also includes $800 million in the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, a program that allows U.S. government to purchase weapons for Ukraine, but the vast majority spending of Ukraine war goes through the emergency funding, and the White House is hoping Congress approves a new $37.7 billion tranche of Ukraine aid during the lame duck period. The NDAA includes $11.5 billion in new investments for the Pacific Defense Deterrence Initiative, a program that to build up the U.S. in the Asia Pacific and to confront China. The Pentagon has identified China as its main focus, and the NDAA includes investments in new technology, research, and development that the U.S. military leaders say is meant to counter Beijing. Now, of course, Connor, as always, it's going to take a few days or probably a few weeks, maybe even up to a month for everybody to unpack the NDAA. It's now a 4,000-page plus bill, I believe, and of course, it's one of the few things that Congress routinely passes. And so we've now created a situation where everybody likes to stuff all their pork and amendments into the NDAA because it's one bill that you could count on being passed. And so there's so much in there to unpack, but it now seems that we had the final version. And of course, one of the most important things is the aid to Taiwan. Now moving on, this article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on December 6th. A Washington, D.C. court judge dismissed a lawsuit brought by the fiancé of murdered Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The fiancé was seeking accountability for Saudi Arabia's de facto head of state, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, but the White House told the court to throw out the case. Khashoggi was last seen in October 2018 when he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, never to re-emerge. While Riyadh initially denied responsibility, Ankara later released proof of the journalist's murder on October 2nd by a team of Saudi nationals closely linked to the Crown Prince. Though the Saudi court convicted several officials for the hit on Khashoggi, human rights advocates have argued that the trial covered up the Saudi government's major role in the plot. The verdict fails to address Saudi authorities' involvement in this devastating crime or clarify the location of Jamal Khashoggi's remains, Amnesty International said in response to the Saudi court's conviction. While the organization's research director, Lynn Mayoff, dubbed the court's case a whitewash. U.S. intelligence agencies agree with Amnesty International with a 2021 report by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence concluding that Saudi Arabian ruler known as MBS ordered the Khashoggi to be killed. After he was murdered, his body was dismembered and never recovered. As MBS skirted punishment in the international community, Khashoggi's fiancée at the time of his death sought justice in the American court system. However, her push to hold the prince accountable was ended on Tuesday by Judge John Bates, who said that he was uneasy about dismissing the lawsuit, but nonetheless concluded MBS was entitled to immunity as determined by the White House. Last month, the State Department issued the determination that MBS should not be charged for the killing in American courts, citing the unbroken practice of guaranteeing immunity to foreign heads of states. On the campaign trail, Biden pledged to change the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia and treat MBS as a global pariah. Since taking office, the White House has, however, largely continued to provide Riyadh with the weapons it needs to wage the war in Yemen and has now allowed Mohammed bin Salman to escape consequences for the killing of journalists working with one of America's top newspapers. Now, Connor, there's really no good news here. However, I did want to just quickly mention that, there's a big push right now to end the war in Yemen. And one of the things that the authors and the people pushing that legislation really feel like is there's a lot of hostility towards the Saudi government. And I think this is another piece of that, right? It's the oil price, it's the war in Yemen. War in Yemen should really be on top of the list, but it's actually close to the bottom. And so at least with this, it's another reason for maybe, even if it's only one or two representatives or senators, that may be the margin needed to get this thing passed. Now I want to move on to another article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, this one on December 7th. And it's titled, Reuters, Nigerian Army Performed Over 10,000 Forced Abortions. Nigerian soldiers fighting against the jihadist group regularly ordered women to be given abortions without their consent, according to a new Reuters investigation. The U.S. has provided Nigeria with billions in military aid, weapons, and training. Victims and soldiers told Reuters that women and girls in the custody in Nigeria's 7th Division were given injections to terminate their pregnancies. Some victims were killed by the abortions, and women who resisted were beaten. It is unclear when the program started, but has reportedly existed since at least 2014. One of over 30 survivors that spoke with the outlet said victims, while undergoing abortions, were not provided medical treatment. And this is a quote from one of the survivors. That woman was more pregnant than the rest of us, almost 6 or 7 months. She was crying, yelling, rolling on the floor, and at long last she stopped rolling and shouting. She became so weak and traumatized, and then she stopped breathing. They just dug a hole and they put sand over it and buried her, she added. The Division 7 operates in the country's northeast, fighting against the Salafist group Boko Haram. According to the Quincy Institute's Knit Turks, Nigeria's military is heavily dependent on America. Since 2000, the U.S. has provided, facilitated, or approved more than $2 billion in security assistance and military weapons and equipment sales to Nigeria, and has conducted more than 41,000 training courses for the Nigerian military personnel to support counterterrorism efforts aimed at defeating Boko Haram and the Islamic State, he wrote in May. While the Reuters report is shocking, Nigeria's armed forces have a history of human rights abuses. And this is from the State Department. Impunity exacerbated by corruption and a weak judiciary remained a significant problem in the security forces, especially in the military, police, and the Department of State Services, the U.S. State Department wrote in its 2021 Human Rights Report on Nigeria. It continued, the military arbitrarily arrested and detained, often in unmonitored military detention facilities, persons in the context of fighting Boko Haram and the Islamic State in West Africa and in the Northeast. So, the State Department is basically saying, we know that these soldiers in this particular region are carrying out abuses, and this is just more expose from Reuters, but the U.S. has been supporting them this whole time. The abuses have not deterred several American presidents from supporting Nigeria. Barack Obama authorized millions in funding to support the Sahel nation's fight against Boko Haram. Under President Donald Trump, American troops conducted multiple training courses for Nigerian soldiers fighting Salafists, while President Joe Biden has already authorized the sale of attack helicopters worth nearly $1 billion. And that was just in this past April. Nigerian military officials denied the claims made by Reuters, insisting the coerced abortions did not happen and that the outlets reporting it as part of a foreign effort to undermine the country's fight against insurgents. Nonetheless, Reuters reported Division 7 adopted the tactics out of a belief it would eliminate Boko Haram. Central to the abortions program is a notion widely held within the military and among some civilians in the Northeast that children of insurgents are predestined by the blood in their veins to one day take up arms against the Nigerian government and society. Military leaders had told their subordinates the program was needed to destroy insurgent fighters before they could be born, according to 4 soldiers and 1 guard cited in the report. So, extremely disturbing there. Connor, I got one more story before I pass this over to you. It is from the Libertarian Institute on December 6th. I wrote this. Canada plans more Taiwan Strait transits. Canadian warships will sail through waters claimed by China at an increased pace, according to a high-ranking official in Ottawa. Foreign Minister Joly announced the new policy after NATO members discussed adopting a more confrontational approach towards Beijing. Speaking with the Financial Times, Joly said Ottawa will ensure Taiwan Strait remains an international body of water. We need to make sure that the question of the Taiwan Strait is clear and that it remains an international strait, she continued, adding, that's why we also had a frigate go through the Taiwan Strait this summer along the Americans, and we're looking to have more frigates go through it. Since President Joe Biden took office, American warships transited the Taiwan Strait on a monthly basis. Beijing sees Taipei as a breakaway province that's still part of its own territory and considers the Taiwan Strait to be within Chinese waters. Officials in Beijing have repeatedly condemned the United States Navy vessels sailing through the strait, insisting they are violating Chinese sovereignty. Washington frequently claims the Taiwan Strait operations help to uphold the rules-based international order. Joly mimicked the White House word for word when explaining why Canadian warships would need to sail just miles off the Chinese coast, vowing to continue to enforce the international rules-based order when it comes to the Taiwan Strait. Ottawa made the announcement shortly after Joly attended a summit of NATO foreign ministers in Romania, where senior officials met to address the challenge posed by the People's Republic. Discussing the meeting, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the U.S.-led military bloc had agreed to adapt in concrete ways to meet the challenges. Joly claimed deploying more Canadian military assets to the region will help ensure peace and stability. However, Beijing has responded to NATO's military presence in Chinese-claimed waters by building up its own armed forces and launching unprecedented military drills near the island of Taiwan last summer, following a high-profile trip by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And Connor, with that, I'm going to let you go ahead. I think you got some news on China first, and then you're going to move on and talk about Iran.
Perfect. That's right. So we've got this one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on December 4th. Lloyd Austin says the Pentagon is aligning its budget like never before to face China. So on Saturday, the former Raytheon board member, now Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, delivered a speech where he reaffirmed the Pentagon's top target is China, which, like other Biden officials, he is accused of seeking to reshape the so-called international order. So Austin said at the Reagan National Defense Forum, now the national defense strategy is clear-eyed about our main competitors, and that starts with the People's Republic of China. Austin said China is the only country, quote, the only country with both the will and increasingly the power to reshape its region and the international order to suit its authoritarian preferences. And General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said stuff similar to this, I believe last year, where he said that, previously America was the unchallenged military, economic, political, and I don't think he said cultural. I forget what else he said, but dominant power throughout the whole world. And that's changing now because of China. And basically, this is around the time when Biden was saying we're going to win the 21st century and the whole from China and make sure that they'll never be the most powerful country in the world, and that we're in extreme competition and this kind of thing. So Austin goes on to say Washington won't let that happen again. And the Pentagon, he said, is aligning our budget as never before to the China challenge. So Austin sets a dramatic tone, declaring that the next few years will set the terms of our competition with Beijing and will determine whether our children and grandchildren inherit an open world of rules and rights or whether they face emboldened autocrats who seek to dominate by force and fear. And this is really, of course, they're just expanding the Elbridge Colby, Donald Trump, General Mattis, foreign policy, this great power competition, national defense strategy of 2018. And like we've been seeing ever since Biden came in, that they've just dressed it up in this totally transparent rhetoric about how this is really about just one more great crusade for democracy in since the progressive era here with these hawks. So now, on the day before, on Saturday, Austin unveiled the new Northrop Grumman-made B-21 Raider bomber, the first new American aircraft bomber in 30 years. Austin said that the B-21 is the long-range strike stealth bomber that will soon be the backbone of the Air Force bomber fleet. The B-21 is part of the modernization of the U.S. nuclear triad, which is said to cost up to $1.5 trillion. And U.S. military officials have made clear that the new bomber is meant to intimidate and scare China. So last year, Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, who's a former vice president of engineering for Raytheon, said that he wanted to see the U.S. invest in new military technologies that will, quote, scare China, and that the B-21 will be very intimidating, as he said. He later said that his priorities as Air Force Secretary are China, China, and China. And of course, Biden's pick to be Secretary of the Navy, Carlos Del Toro, made many of the same remarks, very similar rhetoric. So here's the next one from Dave DeCamp on December 5th from antiwar.com. Papua New Guinea says it can't get caught in the U.S. and Australia's standoff with China. So Papua New Guinea cannot afford to be caught in this standoff between the U.S., Australia, and China, the country's prime minister told The Guardian. So this is, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Prime Minister James Marape was invited to Washington in September for a summit with other Pacific nations as Washington is looking to gain further influence in the region to counter China. Marape said that he told Biden the U.S. seems very far away from Papua New Guinea and that the country couldn't afford to alter its current trade relationships. Quote, so you keep your debates to yourselves and your fights to yourselves. Your enemy is not my enemy. That's a line that is emerging in the Pacific, Marape told The Guardian. He said, because his country is still an emerging economy, it, quote, cannot afford the standoff between our trading partners. And the U.S. And Australia, of course, been furious over China signing a security deal with the Solomon Islands. But Marape said Beijing has never approached him about security arrangements. Quote, the Chinese, to be fair, they have never, in the last 3 years I've been prime minister, they have never pushed that space in terms of asking us to look at security arrangements, setting up a military base, etc. Marape said the country's current security arrangements with Australia were satisfactory since, quote, they're closer to us. It's easier for us to have access to. He said, there is a concern among Pacific leaders about being caught in between the growing U.S.-China rivalry. And of course, other countries in the region have expressed similar concerns, including Papua New Guinea's neighbor to the west, Indonesia, whose president Joko Widodo said in November that the Association of Southeast Asian nations should not allow the region to be a front line for a new Cold War. And of course, the U.S. is trying to expand in Southeast Asia to continue its encirclement as this big pivot to Asia launched under Barack Obama to encircle China. Now, this next one is from Dave, again at antiwar.com on December 6th. China says U.S. report on its nuclear stockpile is groundless speculation. So there was this recent report, the annual report the Pentagon puts out about China's military power. And they made some statements in here that they didn't provide evidence for, of course, but that, China could have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. And now the Chinese Defense Ministry has dismissed this as, quote, groundless speculation and said Washington is hyping up the threat of Beijing's military. So current estimates put China's nuclear arsenal at about 350 warheads, significantly smaller than what the U.S. and Russia possess. Both Washington and Moscow have approximately 6,000 nuclear weapons. Now, the comments criticizing the report came from the Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman, who, according to AFP, said, the report distorts China's defense policy and military strategy. It's groundless speculation on China's military development. And the U.S.'s customary trick is to hype up and exaggerate the so-called Chinese military threat. The United States is making accusations and speculations about the modernization of China's nuclear forces when, in fact, it is the one that should deeply review and reflect on its own nuclear policy. Tan added in his criticism of the report. He also pointed out that unlike the U.S., China has no first use policy when it comes to nuclear weapons. He said, quote, what needs to be emphasized is that China firmly pursues the nuclear strategy of self-defense and defense, always adheres to the policy of no first use of nuclear weapons at any time and under any circumstances, and maintains its nuclear force at the minimum level required for national security, he said. And the Pentagon report also says that China is keeping up persistent military operations around Taiwan, which, as you mentioned earlier, Kyle, was, of course, increased in response to Pelosi's provocative visit to the island in August. Okay, so now we have Senator Hawley. This next one from antiwar.com, December 6th, from Dave DeCamp. Senator Hawley tells Blinken to prioritize arming Taiwan over Ukraine. So this is Senator Josh Hawley. He on Tuesday sent a letter to Antony Blinken urging that the Biden administration prioritize its arming of Taiwan over Ukraine. So Hawley is a big China hawk who introduced legislation last year that aimed to give Taiwan $3 billion a year in U.S. military aid to deter or, if necessary, defeat a Chinese invasion. He has voted against Ukraine aid packages and bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO. I think he was the lone no vote in the Senate on the accession protocols for Sweden and Finland. But his argument was that, we need to be focusing on building up our military surrounding China, preparing for war with China. And so he was emphatic in his letter to Blinken. He says Taiwan is more important for U.S. national interests than Ukraine. Hawley claimed the U.S. needs to start sending more arms to Taiwan to prevent a Chinese invasion. But of course, we know from China's rhetoric and their actions that, this ramping up this support, the stuff that's in the Taiwan Policy Act, for instance, turning Taipei into a major non-NATO ally, escalating their stature in all these international institutions, and building this massive economic war plan, sanctions regime to hit key industries throughout China and their political elite, including President Xi, in the event of I forget the way Graham and Menendez phrased it, but it's similar to a bill that was put out shortly before the war in Ukraine began, where it's very subjective, where it's like if there's an increase in hostilities or something like this. Now, of course, what we're looking at with the NDAA, that's strictly the military aid and not these other ancillaries that are arguably just as, if not more, dangerous. But they are planning on, ironically, Hawley put out this bill last year and it sounded outrageous, but they're planning on giving Taiwan $15 billion in U.S. military aid every year for 5 years, which will turn out to be, like he said, $3 billion a year. Now, the letter also said that if both Taiwan and Ukraine need a certain weapon, it should go to Taiwan first. He points out that there's a massive backlog in deliveries of U.S. weapons that have already been sold to Taiwan as an example of how the U.S. Is failing to arm the island. I think it's something like $19 billion worth of weapons. The letter reads, quote, "The backlog reportedly includes Javelin anti-tank weapons and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. These weapons are vital to an asymmetric defense of Taiwan, but they have yet to arrive in Taiwan, even as the administration has sent thousands to Ukraine." Congress is working on providing, like I said, the $3 billion every year. And it's not clear if that will be passed because they're going to have to make cuts, and it might not in the State Department budget. And it might not get past the Appropriations Committee. But of course, Biden can always ask for it as like emergency funding, and it'll likely pass because there's such a big appetite for arming Taiwan and preparing for potentially another catastrophic proxy war, only with China this time over Taiwan instead of Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. Okay, so we have another one. U.S. to increase military presence in Australia in buildup aimed at China. This is from December 7th from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. On Tuesday, Secretary of Defense Austin said the U.S. will increase its military presence in Australia in a buildup aimed at China. So this is, Austin was in a joint press conference with Australia's defense minister and its foreign minister, and he said the U.S. will increase its rotational forces in Australia. Quote, "That includes rotations of bomber task forces, fighters, and future rotations of U.S. Navy and U.S. Army capabilities. And details on the rotational deployments aren't clear, but they will likely focus on the Australian city of Darwin in the Northern Territory, where U.S. Marines have been rotating for years." Australia's ABC News reported in October the U.S. is deploying or getting set to deploy 6 nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Australia to a base just south of Darwin, and they're building facilities and extending to house the bombers and extending runways. And these enhancements are expected to be completed by 2026. Washington and Canberra have been stepping up military cooperation since they signed the AUKUS military pact with the UK in 2021. Again, this is part of the Asia pivot and building further and further, or building more of these like piecemeal alliances in the region. If you look at the Quad, it's sort of an East Asian style NATO. In this one, they're focusing on providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarine technology, which will no doubt they'll be participating in these patrols along China's coast. A very dangerous situation. These are much more lethal and stealthy than conventionally powered subs. While announcing the additional deployments, Austin accused China of dangerous actions in the region. China's dangerous and coercive actions throughout the Indo-Pacific, including around Taiwan and toward the Pacific Island countries in the East and South China Seas, threaten regional peace and stability. But as we've just heard from Papua New Guinea, they're not interested. They don't see the threat as being worth lining up, or they don't perceive a threat that would necessitate this alliance with America, who's clearly trying to stoke tensions in the region and stoke conflict. So, all right. Now here's a story on Iran that's very interesting, and we all could have seen this coming. This is from antiwar.com on December 5th, by Dave DeCamp. Iran says it won't resume nuclear deal talks under pressure. So this is from the Iranian Foreign Ministry. And this is Nasser Kanani, the spokesman. So they're saying that they will not resume negotiations under pressure. Quote, "American officials know that the Islamic Republic of Iran, under pressure and threats, is not willing to negotiate or make concessions," he said, according to the Iranian news agency MEHR. So since the JCPOA talks fell apart, the U.S. has, of course, ramped up sanctions more and more and expressed support for the protesters inside the country and done these drills we talked about last week, where they're simulating bombing Iran repeatedly, the Americans and the Israelis over the Mediterranean Sea and over Israel with F-35s and F-15s and F-16s and these refueling planes. And so Kanani said that Iran is still dedicated to implementing the nuclear deal and emphasized that it was the U.S. that withdrew from the deal in 2018. He also pointed out that, Paris, Berlin, and London have not done enough to offset American sanctions. And Robert Malley, President Biden's envoy for Iran, who completely failed and it looks like deliberately, reaffirmed on Saturday that the White House is not interested in reviving the JCPOA at this point. And he said America's focus is on Iran's alleged military support for Russia and how to support Iranian protesters. Right now, we can make a difference in trying to deter and disrupt the provision of weapons to Russia and trying to support the fundamental aspirations of the Iranian people, Malley said, while keeping them under maximum pressure sanctions. In an interview with Foreign Policy last week, Malley said the U.S. was supporting the Iranian protesters by, quote, mobilizing international attention and putting the spotlight on what's happening in Iran. He said the U.S. is making sure, quote, Iranians have the ability to express themselves, to share through social media information with each other and with the outside world by sanctioning those up and down the chain in Iran. Malley also said the U.S. would, again, he said, they would resort to a military option as a last resort to stop Iran's nuclear advances. But of course, we know the Pentagon has acknowledged in the nuclear posture review, as well as the National Defense Strategy, that Iran, not only as we already knew from their compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty since 1970, and the Safeguards Agreement, that they don't have nuclear weapons, that they've just confirmed now that also the U.S. government knows, the Pentagon knows, that that Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon either. And now the Pentagon is saying that, and of course, in December of 2021, very importantly, William Burns came out and made that emphatically clear after the Israelis accused Iran of seeking a nuclear weapon at the beginning of negotiations with the new government led by President Raisi. And so, so we'll have to see what happens next. I don't see how much more. I mean, it doesn't appear like the leverage, what used to work for the Iranians of increasing their, further advancing their nuclear program. It looks like it's just being used now to beat them over the head. They've ramped up the rate that they're producing, the 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride with some new advanced equipment, but they've already said that they're never going to advance beyond that. Of course, it's no proliferation risk. And it'll just be used to create more fear-mongering around the topic itself. And we've already had, such luminaries as Hillary Clinton come out and say, I wouldn't negotiate at all with Iran, especially over a nuclear deal. And this is a big part of all the anti-Iran rhetoric right now. It's just pointing at their domestic situation and the protests and how they're handling it and saying that this is an excuse for either totally, the hawks are really saying that we should cut off all relations with Iran, and so should Europe, and pull their ambassadors and just completely cut ties, any kind of ties at all, and just completely put the nuclear talks to bed for good, and maintain the economic war and the maximum pressure campaign, which is hurting the civilian population more than anything. The country is devastated. More than 50% of the country, or around 50%, live below the poverty line, and the inflation rate is about 40 or 50%. And they don't care about the Iranian people. This is about building up tensions and making sure that the status quo remains and that the deal is dead.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that update. And everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Just a reminder, if you can, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, make a donation, help us hit our fundraiser goal. Connor, again, thanks so much for tuning in, man.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kyle.